The first time I saw Zilka, I didn't think much of them. Just another quiet, solitary figure in the sea of orphaned children that filled the Galactic orphanage. The place was a strange mix of order and chaos, an institution meant to provide shelter for those who had lost everything, yet incapable of truly making up for what had been taken from them. Humans, reptilians, avians, amphibious species, all of them coexisted under one roof, their differences both a barrier and a source of reluctant camaraderie. But Zilka was different. Even among the lonely, they were alone. I had been sent there as part of a humanitarian effort. The United Earth Federation had an ongoing mission to provide aid to war-torn colonies and displaced children. And since I was stationed nearby, I'd volunteered to assist with food distribution and medical checkups. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. Zilka caught my eye, not because they were particularly large or imposing. On the contrary, they were smaller than the average Kre'xi adult, with dark blue chitin that barely reflected the artificial lights of the facility. Their forearms were always folded close to their body, their movements careful, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Where other children at least attempted to form bonds, however fragile, Zilka remained apart. Not unfriendly, not hostile, just removed. The Kre'xi were an insectoid species, their society structured around rigid caste hierarchies. The moment a Kre'xi lost their family, their hive, they were marked as outcasts. No second chances, no reintegration. Among their own kind, Zilka was less than nothing, and unfortunately for them, that exile extended beyond just social status. It also meant no one would ever accept them as a mate. I hadn't known this at first. I only saw an orphan sitting alone at meal hours, eating in silence, while the others at least grouped together in species-based clusters. It was the head caretaker, a burly Yildrin woman, who first mentioned it to me when she caught me watching Zilka. "Don't waste your time," she said, shaking her head. "That one's got no future." I frowned. "That's a bit harsh, don't you think?" she sighed, setting down the datapad she had been using to catalogue medical supplies. "You don't understand their kind. Kre'xi don't do lone survivors. A hatchling without a hive is a defect in their eyes. No hive will take them in. No mate will claim them. They won't even be allowed into the worker caste." I glanced back at Zilka, who was meticulously picking apart their nutrient cube, antenna barely twitching. "What happens to them then?" I asked. The caretaker's mandibles clicked together, a Yildrin expression of disapproval. "They survive as long as they can. And when they can't anymore, well, no one will come looking." The thought unsettled me more than I cared to admit. The orphanage did what it could, but it was only a temporary solution. By the time these children reached adulthood, they were expected to leave and fend for themselves. Some species had support systems in place. Relatives, extended families, governmental assistance. But if what the caretaker said was true, Zilka had no such safety net. I found myself watching them more after that. Not in a nosy way. At least, I hoped not, but just paying attention. They were careful, always avoiding attention. If someone moved too close, they adjusted their position. If another Kre'xi entered the room, their body tensed, their posture shifting subtly to avoid direct eye contact. The younger Kre'xi orphans didn't seem to outright bully them, but there was a noticeable distance, an unspoken agreement to ignore Zilka's presence entirely. One evening, while distributing meal rations, I made a split-second decision and sat down across from them. They froze mid-motion, one of their lower arms still holding onto a half-eaten portion of food. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, cautiously, they set their food down and tilted their heads slightly. "You are in the wrong seat." I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't see your name on it." Their mandibles twitched slightly, a sign of nervousness. "You are not Kre'xi." "Nope," I agreed. "Not last time I checked." Another pause. They watched me carefully, their large black eyes reflecting the soft glow of the dining hall's overhead lights. I could tell they were waiting for something. For me to leave, maybe, or for me to say something cruel. Instead, I took a bite of my own meal and gestured at their plate. "You gonna eat that?" Zilka hesitated. Then, slowly, they resumed, eating. That was the first time I sat with them. It wouldn't be the last. At first, Zilka barely acknowledged my presence. They tolerated me sitting across from them during meals, but never initiated conversation. They were cautious, their large black eyes studying me in that unreadable way insectoids had. I didn't mind. I wasn't expecting immediate friendship. It wasn't about that. It was about making sure they weren't alone. The Galactic orphanage was always loud, always bustling with activity, 100 different languages being spoken at any given moment. Yet Zilka existed in a bubble of silence. Even among the outcasts, they were the one truly left behind. I started making a habit of sitting with them, talking even when they didn't answer. I told them about my work, about the ridiculous bureaucratic nonsense that made relief missions take longer than they should. I joked about human food being an acquired taste, about how even I couldn't tell the difference between some of the ration flavors. Sometimes they would just stare at me, utterly still. Other times, their mandibles would twitch in a way I thought might be amusement, though I couldn't be sure. Kre'xi expressions were hard to read, but I was learning. It took weeks before they said anything beyond a few words. One evening, as we sat under the artificial sky dome of the orphanage's courtyard, they finally spoke. "Why do you speak to me, human?" Their voice was soft, clicking in that precise way Kre'xi speech always did. I could hear the uncertainty beneath the question, as if they were bracing for a cruel joke. I shrugged. "Because you look like you could use a friend." Zilka's posture stiffened slightly. They tilted their head, antennae twitching. "Kre'xi do not have friends. We have hives." I nodded. "Well, humans have friends, and I think you could use one." They were silent for a long time, their gaze fixed on the glowing overhead projection of stars above us. The orphanage tried to simulate a planetary night sky, something to give the children a sense of normalcy, but it always looked a little too perfect. No atmospheric distortion, no slight flickers, just a digital recreation of what someone thought the night should look like. When Zilka finally spoke again, their voice was quieter. "My kind do not form bonds the way yours do." I thought about that. Kre'xi society was strict, structured. Their entire existence revolved around their hive, their purpose dictated from the moment they hatched. Orphans had no place in that structure. They weren't just abandoned, they were erased. "Maybe that's a problem with your kind," I said. "Not with you." Zilka turned to me, their chitin reflecting the soft blue light of the artificial sky. "You say this because you are human. You do not understand. Then help me understand." Another long pause. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, they extended one of their lower arms and placed it on the bench between us. It was a tentative gesture, careful, unsure. I hesitated, then reached out and placed my hand near theirs. I didn't know exactly what the gesture meant in Kre'xi culture, but it felt important. Zilka's chitin shimmered faintly, not grey, not the dull, lifeless shade I had grown used to. Blue. I didn't know much about Kre'xi coloration, but I had heard of that one. Blue meant hope. As the years passed, I continued visiting the orphanage whenever my assignments allowed. My work took me to different parts of the galaxy, diplomatic meetings, relief efforts, peacekeeping missions, but I always found my way back. And every time, without fail, Zilka was still there, still alone. By then, we had settled into an easy rhythm. Whenever I returned, we would sit together, sharing meals and conversations. I had learned to read the subtle shifts in their chitin, the way their antennae twitched when they were uncertain, the careful way they moved when they were trying to hide their emotions. Kre'xi was supposed to be rigid, practical, a species that prioritized function over feeling. But Zilka had feelings. They had doubts, fears, wants. They had never spoken about it outright, but I knew what lingered beneath the surface, an ever-present loneliness, and it was getting worse. One day, after a long absence, I found Zilka sitting in the same spot in the courtyard where we had first talked about friendship. But they were different this time. Their chitin, which usually held a faint shimmer of colour, was dull. Not grey exactly, but not vibrant either. A hollow in-between. Their posture was rigid, tense, as if they were bracing for something. I sat beside them, setting down the small bag of supplies I had brought as a gift. "You okay?" They hesitated. Then, without looking at me, they said, "I have no future." The statement was so blunt that it took me a moment to process it. "What are you talking about?" Zilka exhaled, a strange clicking sound that might have been the Kre'xi version of a sigh. "The caretakers say I have reached the age of maturity. Soon, I will be expected to leave." I frowned. "Leave and go where?" They turned to me, their large black eyes locking onto mine. "Nowhere." It hit me then. The orphanage wasn't a permanent home. It was a temporary shelter, a place for displaced children to grow until they could integrate into society. But Zilka had no society to return to. No hive, no status, no place among their own kind, and no one wanted to take them in. A cold weight settled in my stomach. "There has to be something they can do," I said. "Some kind of program, a work placement, anything." Zilka's mandibles twitched in a bitter, humorless way. "I have no caste. No hive will take me. No Kre'xi will mate with me. My species has no use for outcasts." I clenched my fists. "That's bullshit." They didn't argue, just stared out at the artificial sky, their chitin shifting ever so slightly toward a duller shade. For the first time, I saw something close to defeat in them. They had always been quiet, reserved, careful with their words. But they had never looked broken. I refused to accept it. "What if you didn't have to?" I asked. Zilka turned toward me again, their head tilting in that sharp, precise way they always did when they were trying to understand something. "Explain." I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was about to say, only that I couldn't sit there and do nothing. "What if I took you in?" Their antennae twitched. "Humans do not have hives." "No, but we have families. We have partnerships." I took a breath. "What if you didn't need a Kre'xi hive? What if you had a human instead?" Zilka was silent for a long time. Their chitin shimmered faintly, but not blue. Not yet. Finally they said, "That is not done." I met their gaze and said, "Maybe it should be." At first, Zilka refused, not in an angry way, not even in a surprised way. Just quiet, careful denial. "Kre'xi do not bond outside of our species," they said one evening after I had brought it up again. We were sitting in the courtyard, the artificial sky stretching overhead, its programmed stars as cold and distant as the future they seemed resigned to. "It is unnatural." I leaned back against the bench, stretching my legs out in front of me. "Unnatural, according to who?" Zilka's mandibles clicked softly. "Everyone." "That's not true," I said. "There are interspecies, couples all over the galaxy. Humans and Akarans, Yildrin and Valtari. Hell, I even met a Zelvan married to a Goran once, and those two species tried to wipe each other out a few hundred years ago." Zilka was quiet for a moment. Their antennae twitched, the movement hesitant, uncertain. "But they are not Kre'xi," I sighed. "You keep saying that like it's a rule written into the fabric of the universe. Just because your kind has never done something before doesn't mean it can't be done." Their chitin flickered, the colour too subtle for me to read. Then they asked, "Why do you care so much?" That question stopped me. I hadn't really thought about it, not in those exact terms. At first, it had just been about making sure they weren't alone. Then it had become about proving something. Proving that they had worth. that their people were wrong to discard them. But now it was something more. Because you matter to me, I said. The words were simple, but I meant them. And I don't want to see you waste away just because your people are too stubborn to see that. Zilka didn't answer right away. Their gaze flickered downward, arms folding tightly against their torso in a self-protective gesture. I had learned enough about Kre'xi body language to know they weren't rejecting what I said outright. They were thinking, processing. I didn't push them. I had learned early on that Kre'xi didn't respond well to pressure. They weren't impulsive creatures. They made decisions carefully, weighing every possibility before acting. So I let them sit in silence, their chitin catching the pale glow of the artificial moonlight. Finally, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, Zilka said, "Do humans form life bonds?" I turned toward them. Their posture was rigid, their mandibles still. "Some of us do," I said. "Not all, but some." Another long pause. I could hear the distant chatter of the other orphans in the background, the sounds of mealtime wrapping up, of caretakers ushering children to their sleeping quarters. But here, in this little corner of the courtyard, it was just us. Zilka's chitin shimmered again. A faint blue, not strong, not certain, but present. Then, "I accept," they said. I exhaled, releasing a tension I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't a grand declaration of love. It wasn't some dramatic moment of passion. That wasn't how the Kre'xi worked. But it was something real, something that mattered. And I knew, in that moment, that neither of us would be alone again. Convincing the orphanage to let me take Zilka in was harder than I expected. The caretakers were skeptical, not outright hostile, but confused by the idea. Kre'xi didn't bond outside their own kind, and they certainly didn't get adopted by humans. But I had spent enough time in bureaucracy to know that if you pushed hard enough, cited enough loopholes, and filled out enough paperwork, almost anything was possible. "What exactly is the nature of this arrangement?" One of the administrators, a thin, bird-like Kirin, asked me, her feathers ruffling slightly as she skimmed the forms I had submitted. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. "It's an adoption, simple as that." The Kirin clicked her beak softly. "You do understand that cross-species adoptions are rare, and that the Kre'xi do not recognize such bonds?" I nodded. "Their government doesn't, no. But they also don't recognize orphans. If they don't care what happens to Zilka, why should they care who takes them in?" She flicked through the pages again. "Humans don't form hive structures. You won't be able to provide the social framework that a Kre'xi normally requires. I can provide stability," I countered. "I can provide security, a home, a future." Her feathers ruffled again, but this time she seemed thoughtful. "You're serious about this? I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." She studied me for a long moment before finally sighing and setting the forms aside. "This will require approval from multiple departments," she said. "But given Zilka's circumstances, I don't believe anyone will object. The Kre'xi government has made it clear they have no interest in their outcasts. If you're willing to take responsibility, the orphanage won't stand in your way." It took another 2 weeks for everything to be finalized. During that time, I prepared. I had been stationed at a small human outpost on the edge of Federation space, a quiet settlement primarily used for research and trade. It wasn't much, but it had everything we needed: a home, a place to work, a community that, while small, was open to outsiders. When I finally returned to the orphanage for the last time, Zilka was waiting for me in the same courtyard where we had spent so many nights talking. Their posture was tense, their arms folded tightly against their torso. "You are certain?" they asked as I approached. I nodded. "Yeah, papers are signed. It's official now." Zilka didn't move. "I do not know how to be human." I smiled. "Good thing I'm not asking you to be." They stared at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, they extended one of their lower arms. I had learned by now that Kre'xi weren't physically affectionate, at least not in the way humans were, but this was something, a gesture of trust, of acceptance. I reached out and clasped their arm gently, my fingers brushing against the cool, chitinous surface. "Let's go home," I said. Zilka's chitin shimmered again, faint blue, stronger than before, and together we left the orphanage behind. Adjusting to life together wasn't easy. Zilka had never known anything outside of the orphanage, and before that, they had only known rejection. The concept of home was foreign to them. They didn't understand why I had a couch if I didn't sleep on it, why humans had separate rooms for cooking and eating, or why I had so many clothes when I only ever wore one set at a time. They questioned everything, not out of rudeness, but because nothing about human life made sense to a Kre'xi who had never lived outside of a hive. I tried to be patient, but I wasn't perfect. There were times when their endless questions exhausted me, when I wished they would just accept something without analyzing it to death. But then, I would remember that they had never been given the space to ask questions before, that they had spent their entire life trying to survive in a world that didn't want them. So I answered, even when it frustrated me. The hardest part, though, wasn't the little things. It wasn't teaching them how to use a human-style shower or explaining why I needed personal space sometimes. It was the loneliness I saw in them, the deep, aching sense of not belonging. One night, after months of living together, I found them sitting in the dark, their chitin dim and dull. They were curled into themselves, legs tucked beneath their body in a posture I had come to recognize as distress. I sat down beside them. "You okay?" They hesitated before answering. "I do not understand my place." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Zilka's mandibles twitched. In a hive, every Kre'xi has a role, a function, a purpose. Even if that purpose is to serve and die, there is structure. They turned their large black eyes toward me. "With you, there is no structure, no caste, no function. I do not know what I am." I exhaled slowly. I had suspected this was coming. Kre'xi weren't built for freedom, not the way humans were. They were conditioned from birth to serve a role, to be part of something larger than themselves. Even though Zilka had been cast out, they had still spent their life longing for that structure. And now they were with me, a human, a species that thrived on chaos and choice. It had to be terrifying. "You don't have to be anything," I said finally. "You don't have to serve a purpose to be worth something." They didn't respond. Their antennae twitched, betraying their uncertainty. I sighed and leaned back against the wall. Humans don't always know what our place is either. Some of us spend our whole lives trying to figure it out, and sometimes we just make it up as we go. I turned my head to look at them. "You don't have to fit into a hive, you can just be you." Zilka was silent for a long time. Then, so softly I almost didn't hear it, they said, "I do not know who I am." I smiled, nudging them lightly with my shoulder. "Then we'll figure it out together." Their chitin shimmered, not quite blue, not quite grey, something in between. But it was a start. Zilka changed little by little. Not in the way humans did, not with sudden bursts of growth, not with grand revelations. Their change was slow, deliberate, careful. At first they clung to routine, trying to create a structure where none had existed before. They woke at the same time every morning, ate the same foods in the same order, and kept everything in the house meticulously organized. It was their way of making sense of things, of imposing the hive-like order they had been raised to believe was necessary. But slowly, they began to relax. They started experimenting, trying new foods, rearranging the furniture, changing their daily habits. They stopped treating every action as if it had to have a predetermined function. They even picked up hobbies, something that had once baffled them. They spent hours observing insects in the outpost's greenhouse, their fascination with the small crawling creatures evident even if they never outright admitted it. One day, I caught them carefully sketching one of the insects in a small notebook. When they realized I was watching, they immediately closed the book and turned away. "You like drawing?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. Zilka hesitated. "It is an inefficient use of time," I shrugged. "So? Do you enjoy it?" Long pause. Then, almost too quietly to hear, they said, "Yes." I smiled. Then that's all that matters. Moments like that became more common. They stopped measuring their worth in usefulness, stopped questioning whether they had a function. They started existing for themselves, in their own way. It was slow, sometimes frustrating, but it was progress. And then, one day, something happened that I had never expected. Zilka brought up the topic of mating. We had never talked about it before, not in any serious way. Kre'xi reproduction was complex, involving pheromonal bonding, genetic exchanges through external secretion, and a whole host of biological processes that were completely foreign to humans. The topic had always seemed irrelevant between us. But that day, as we sat outside watching the twin moons rise over the outpost, they spoke carefully, deliberately. "I have been thinking," they said, their antennae twitching. "About the future." I raised an eyebrow. "Okay." They hesitated. "Kre'xi mate for survival, for the continuation of the hive." Their chitin shimmered, flickering with uncertainty. "But I have no hive, no caste, no expectation of producing offspring." I nodded, waiting for them to continue. "And yet," they said, voice softer now, "I wish to bond." I blinked. Of all the things I had expected them to say, that hadn't been one of them. "Bond?" I echoed. Zilka shifted slightly. "Humans form bonds of choice, not for function, but for connection." Their mandibles twitched and their chitin flickered between blue and a shade I had never seen before. Something deep and rich, like the ocean at night. "I wish to choose." I stared at them, my heart beating a little faster than it should have. "And you're choosing me?" Zilka's black eyes met mine. "I already have." I didn't know what to say to that. For so long, I had fought for them to have a life, to have a future. But I had never stopped to think about where I fit into that future. I reached out, resting my hand against their forearm. Their chitin was cool beneath my fingers. "Then I guess we figure this out together." Their chitin shimmered, deepening into that rich, midnight hue. This time, I knew what it meant. It meant home.